The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar on how cooling as a service is set to revolutionize the cooling industry. I'm Vida Rosita from the Energy Efficiency Division of the International Energy Agency, and I'm joined by my colleague Emily McWalter. We will be moderating the webinar today. I very much hope that you, your families and friends are well and remain so. We are in an unprecedented situation. The IEA is hard at work on developing analysis and policy recommendations to support governments, especially on how economic stimulus can be strategically used to support clean energy transitions. We are very pleased today to have a positive story to share with you on innovative approach that can help accelerate the deployment of efficient and sustainable technologies and improve access to cooling, which in many parts of the world is increasingly essential to support health, productivity, and development. We have some great speakers lined up for you today. Thomas from Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy will explain the cooling as a service concept, provide us with insights of its origins, and share lessons learned and experiences to date from a range of pilots and demonstration projects that have been implemented around the world, and give us an update on what are future plans and opportunities. And Jim and Peter from Sustainable Development Capital Limited will share their insights as investors and representatives of the financial community. This will be followed by an opportunity for you to participate in the discussion by providing your questions. For questions, please use the chat box. Enter your questions. Please ask your questions in English. You can also use this opportunity to give us suggestions on further topics or issues that you'd like to see covered in other webinars. The webinar will be recorded and the presentation will be available online, and we will be sending you an email with the link. Before I hand over to Thomas, just a brief overview of the Super Efficient Equipment and Appliance Deployment Initiative. The initiative brings together 19 member countries, partners, and a broad community of interested stakeholders to create opportunities to share experiences and learnings on the development of measures to stimulate the development and deployment of efficient products. It's an initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial that the IEA is coordinating. And while this is part of our webinar series of cooling, we within SEAD cover a full range of equipment and appliances. And we are in the process of exploring opportunities to do similar webinar series focusing on other product categories. So your feedback and suggestions on these would be interesting as well. And SEAD is still currently in a phase of redesign, which we started when the IEA took over the coordination of the initiative last September. We have a lot of good ideas on types of activities that could be useful to develop a vibrant community of best practice and opportunities for knowledge sharing. And again, we welcome your views and your suggestions. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Thomas, who will take us on a journey to understand how cooling as a service works and what benefits it can offer to us. Please, Thomas.
Thank you, Vida, and to the International Energy Agency as a whole, as well as to Peter and Jim for joining me as panelists here, and to each and every one of you, of course, to take the time to listen to our experience with this new business model. Next, Vida. Before I start, I'd like to give some context about BASE, the organization I work for, which is a not-for-profit foundation and a specialized partner of United Nations Environment, founded in 2001. We design, develop, and implement innovative business models, financing structures, and risk mitigation mechanisms to incentivize investments in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and climate change solutions. Over the past 3 years, we have increasingly focused on efficient cooling through various partnerships with the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, KSEP, which is a philanthropy under ClimateWorks based in California. And in 2018, we launched the Cooling as a Service initiative, which aims to increase the adoption of more efficient cooling systems through the use of a new business model. Next video. So to start with, to give a sense of scale, I'd like to show some data extracted from the Future of Cooling report, actually prepared by the IEA. And so first of all, in 2018, air conditioning alone consumed 10% of the world's electricity across all sectors. And this is set to triple by 2050, which means that air conditioning will consume as much electricity as China does in total today. So this demand growth is due to economic development and population growth, in particular in warm regions, as well as to rising temperatures. And many of the systems currently in operation also use refrigerants, which have a significant impact on climate change, rather than their climate-friendly alternatives. Next video. The air conditioning market is set to grow steadily during the next years, with households and companies investing around $210 billion each year in new air conditioning systems over the next 30 years. And actually, we see this as an opportunity because most of this capital could be invested in clean and efficient cooling if we manage to overcome some of the key market barriers. Next. This diagram shows how the life cycle cost of an air conditioning system is divided between the initial investment and the operating costs. And you can see that actually the main component contributing to the life cycle cost of the cooling equipment is electricity consumption. The initial investment is only a small fraction. So in other words, the total cost of ownership of cooling system is most effectively reduced by installing the most efficient systems. However, despite the clear economic benefits of increasing energy efficiency for building owners and businesses, investments in cleaner cooling are not being made at the scale expected. And in fact, data from the Future of Cooling shows that customers purchase systems that are significantly less efficient than the best available technology. So our question is, why does this happen? Next. And this can be explained by several factors that we have identified. First, customers are normally sensitive to purchase price, even though energy cost savings would ultimately make up for the additional upfront cost. Second, customers often lack trust in the performance of the equipment, whether the promised savings will really be achieved. And third, customers prefer to invest in their core business. But there are also exactly these reasons that give space to the opportunity to transition to a much more appropriate business model that overcome all of these barriers that can create significant customer value. Next. Servitization, or moving from selling products to selling services, or really moving from a transaction model to a subscription model. And in cooling, we call this cooling as a service. Next. And products, so cooling as a service is a model that was presented to the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, a highly reputable group of institutions and investors in government, the private sector, development finance, and philanthropy, who endorsed basically cooling as a service as one of the most innovative, actionable, and scalable financial instruments of 2019 among more than 250 applicants. And the way it works is customers pay for the cooling service per unit of cooling consumed instead of actually investing in the equipment. And the technology provider owns the cooling system, maintains it, and covers all operational costs, including electricity and water. So this means it's in the provider's own interest to install the equipment with highest efficiency, as well as to offer excellent preventive maintenance to reduce the cost to deliver this service. So what used to be a capital expense for building owners now becomes an operational expense. So cooling as a service encourages the use of more efficient cooling equipment because the overall cost of this service will be lower for those technologies that have lower operating costs. The model includes different possible financial structures to enable recapitalization of cash providers, for example, through special purpose vehicles or sale-leaseback mechanism. In itself, product as a service models are not new and are growing rapidly across industries. Many of you know the Xerox model since many years, in which instead of selling copy machines, the company charges its customer per copy. And similarly, Rolls-Royce has been selling power by the hour since many years, rather than selling the engines to airplanes. In the solar sector, power purchase agreements have really enabled the unexpectedly rapid uptake of photovoltaic technology by enabling customers to purchase kilowatt hours of solar energy instead of having to invest in the solar panels, essentially eliminating the performance risk perceived by customers. And some companies now, like Volvo, are offering their cars on a service contracts, and the Amsterdam Schiphol Airport signed an agreement with Philips to receive lighting as a service, paying per out of lighting. So in the air conditioning sector, and more broadly cooling, including refrigeration, we're really currently at the brink of a revolution, and Sovietization is now attracting significant attention across regions because the model has the potential to be a true game changer for the cooling industry, making more efficient technologies more competitive than cheaper, less efficient technologies. Next. So this is just to show a little bit the differentiation between cooling as a service and other models. There are many mechanisms available, but these two are normally confused with cooling as a service. The first one is what we call ESCO models. It could be an ESCO could be implementing cooling as a service. That's not the issue, but here I just want to make the difference between the typical shared savings and guaranteed savings energy performance contracts and CAS, because in the case of CAS, payments, the price per unit consumed is agreed in advance as a function of actual usage, and payments, while in the EPC contracts, energy performance contracts, the payments depend on energy savings, and this can create conflicts, while in CAS this is not the case. And district cooling is the case in which one large infrastructure is offering cooling to several buildings, while cooling as a service is really offering or enabling one building to outsource the cooling service. Next. The model has advantages for the main stakeholders involved, which are basically cooling users, suppliers, as well as investors. Next. For customers, the model overcomes the key barriers that we raised before, because the customer does not need to make the initial investment, is no longer exposed to the performance risk of the equipment, and can focus on its core business by fully outsourcing the cooling service. Next. For technology providers, the move to cooling as a service allows to create additional value for the customer and to fully deploy the potential of the technology because they're now operating it. It can also generate predictable, continuous, and additional revenue streams throughout the product lifecycle. And it is a strategic response to both trade wars, which apply normally to goods rather than services, and sustainability challenges by stimulating a circular economy in which assets are redesigned for long-term use. Next. Many investors have green financing available and are actually looking for projects to allocate these funds to. And cooling as a service is a safe and easy to understand vehicle to generate a pipeline for investors to create green portfolios. Because CAS also enables financiers, which can be banks or funds, to invest in assets generating cash flows. And Peter and Jim can give their perspective later on from an investment point of view. Next. So, and next again. So without going too much into detail, I'd like to show a couple of financial structures that can enable the scale up of cooling as a service, because we have now providers offering a service and having to own the asset. This first one is what we call sale and leaseback, and it's a form of asset-backed finance. So after a solution provider signs one or more cooling as a service contracts with customers, these assets, which are now still owned by the solution provider, can be sold to a bank and then leased back from that bank. The contracts with the customers serve as an additional collateral to the bank, and any applicable payment guarantee, which could reduce default risk for the technology provider, can also be endorsed to the bank. Next. And other financial structures, of course, are possible. This one is the more classical one. It's based on project finance, in which a special purpose vehicle is set up, which purchases the equipment from the technology provider and is the one signing the contract with the customers. Next. So what are we doing at BASE? So we are this NGO, and we are working together with KSEP, Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, and we're leading the Cooling as a Service initiative to stimulate the markets to adopt this model. So the initiative includes a couple of components. First, we have been developing tools to enable the model, and these include cooling as a service contracts, pricing models, and financial structures to monetize CAS projects. Second, we are working with technology providers and investment funds to test and pilot the model in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Thirdly, we have created partnerships with different actors to establish the Cooling as a Service Alliance, which today includes almost 40 organizations, including global cooling system manufacturers such as Daikin, Johnson Controls, Trane, investment funds such as SDCL, and others, and also organizations such as the World Green Building Council or Sustainable Energy for All, who help to spread the word about the model. And finally, our goal is also really, as said, to spread the word about the model through events, workshops, webinars, publications. And for instance, we had our first matchmaking event taking place earlier this year in South Africa. Of course, with the global health situation, we are planning, we are going virtual, planning a global e-conference on cooling as a service. And the aim of these conferences and these events is to bring together potential CAS adopters, providers, and investors. Next. One of the tools that we have developed is an economic model, and you can see here some results that show that cooling as a service can actually be the most attractive scenario for customers. These results can be found in the paper that we have developed together with the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, and it's available online on the lab website. And the model itself will be made public this summer. It will not be the exact same model. It will be a model that can be easily used by the different stakeholders. Next. On the world map, this world map, you can see where cooling as a service is currently being implemented. So we are supporting technology providers in the Caribbean, in Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Grenada, in Mexico, in Costa Rica, in Argentina, in Nigeria, in South Africa, and in India to implement the model. We're also working closely with MGM Innova Group, who has been implementing the model in Colombia. And we know the company Kair, based in Singapore, is implementing the model in Singapore, Malaysia, and India. Next. Before giving this is a case study. I wanted to quickly show one model that has one building that has been receiving cooling as a service. It was implemented by MGM Innova Group. It is a commercial building which has a highly efficient 580-ton refrigeration chiller installed. And basically, the actual amount of cooling that is delivered to each user, so to each office, is measured. The investment was fully carried on by MGM, and the monthly payments are, so there's two components. One is the fixed component, which the actual building operator is paying for the common spaces, and there is a variable component which each user is paying. So this is the way it's structured, and both client and final user. So there is savings achieved here, which are of 1.2 gigawatt hour per year, and a reduction of I think it was 440. Maybe Vida, if you can just close that one. 440 ton of CO2 per year. So this is a case study, and there are also some existing cases in Asia, for instance, in Singapore. Next. So before giving the floor back to Vida and then to Peter and Jim, I'd like to encourage you to get involved. You can join the Cooling as a Service Alliance to roll out the model or to spread the word and build capacity about the opportunities and benefits of cooling as a service. On the website cas-initiative.org, which we will share later, you can find more information about the mechanics of the model, as well as a video explaining the model that you can share. And I, of course, invite you as well to register to our newsletter to stay updated about the progress. We have been doing a lot over the past year, and the next year is going to be very exciting as well for this initiative. Next. And thank you very much. And you have my contact details here. And I give the floor back to Vida.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this comprehensive overview and showing how this solution can really overcome some of the very persistent barriers that have been blocking investments in energy efficiency for decades. And so I'm very pleased that we now have the opportunity also to hear from colleagues from the investment community to provide their viewpoints and their experiences of working with cooling as a service. So with that, I'll hand over to Peter. Peter, we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? To the audience, please bear with us. We'll try to sort out a slight technical glitch.
Yeah.
We should be online shortly.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Peter.
Oh, great, good. I'm not sure what happened there. Good morning, everybody. I'm very sorry for that. That's eaten up another couple of minutes of our time, so I'll be very brief. I'll quickly introduce SDCL and then talk a little bit about the commercial approach of cooling as a service that we're planning to implement. And then Jim will talk a little bit more about the KSEP program that we're involved with in Asia and Africa. So if we could go on to the first slide, please, Vida. So SDCL is a specialist manager of investments into sustainable energy projects. We're based out of London, and we operate a number of funds and instruments around the world. So in the UK, we're the manager of a listed company called SEAD, which went onto the market in 2018 as a £100 million IPO and is now a £400 million company. So it's grown very quickly, and is, we think, the only listed company that we know of that invests exclusively into and operates exclusively energy efficiency projects around the world. We also have a fund in Ireland, run out of Dublin, that's co-financed by the government of Ireland, and along with them a range of commercial investors. Out of New York, with the New York Green Bank, we run a similar energy efficiency fund. And in Singapore, working with the Singapore government, we run a smaller fund that invests into energy efficiency projects in Singapore. And all of those are based around the basic model of investing into demand side or decentralized energy projects in order to reduce the requirement for the host to the host energy requirements from off-grid, from grid supplies, either through production of their own decentralized sustainable energy through things like cogeneration or rooftop solar PV, or demand side measures in energy efficiency, building management systems, efficient lighting, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please, Vida. So very quickly looking at the basic commercial model, this is in a way a simpler form of one of the examples that Thomas explained. And just to preface all of this, the basic commercial model here is energy efficiency as a service, which is something that's been around for a long time and which SDCL is the leading specialist in, and we've implemented energy efficiency as a service projects around the world for many, many years. And this is the basic model. It's very, very straightforward, and many of you will have seen something similar before. We sit at the top of all of that as the manager of the funds, and for each project we'll set up a special purpose vehicle in the domicile of the host, and that's the project vehicle that runs everything. And so the host company will enter into an energy or a cooling services agreement with the SPV. So there's a single point of contact for the host, which is with the SPV, and then the fund capitalizes the SPV with whatever is the appropriate capital structure, a mixture of equity and debt, and the SPV dividends back that investment by way of returns to the fund. And then the SPV goes about the job of implementing the project by contracting an ESCO to fulfill the actual project construction and operation. So we'd enter into an engineering performance contract, an energy performance contract with the ESCO, and usually an O&M agreement providing for the operation and maintenance of the assets for the life of the project, which could be 10, 15, or even 20 years. And then the ESCO has the advantage of a single contract point for itself as well, and it doesn't have to find the funds as we take care of all of that. And the cooling as a service model works in exactly the same way, in that way as the energy efficiency as a service model. So it's very natural area to move into for a company that's used to doing energy efficiency as a service. Next slide, please. And this slide looks at the kind of process that's involved with that. And again, many of you will be familiar with the kind of flow from feasibility through to build an O&M as part of a natural project finance cycle. But the key point is that the fund through the SPV is a single point of responsibility, taking care of all of that from start to finish, with correspondingly taking all of the risks associated with that. The key element that we're bringing to this as part of the Kigali program, which Jim will talk about, is dealing with the first part of that slide, with the feasibility and the design and engineering. And in our partnership with the KSEP program, that's enabling us to cover that initial feasibility stage through investment grade audits that are funded by KSEP, where we're working with selected ESCO partners to undertake the IGAs and the initial design work, then leading to being able to put a commercial energy services agreement or cooling as a service agreement proposal in front of the client. And then moving to the right of that, we go into the sort of purely commercial phase, if you like, of the project, working with a contracted ESCO to deal with the project management and construction, and then the operation and maintenance through the life of the project. And the advantages of that approach are that we can bring everything down to a single point of contact through a party that's dealing with a lot of these projects around the world. So we have the ability to bring in best-in-class delivery partners through efficient and well-rehearsed procurement processes, which ensure that we get the best quality technical delivery and the most competitive terms. And this is an area that for many hosts is a challenge, that have different experience in procurement and very often are focused on delivering the lowest cost solution, not necessarily the most effective in terms of energy efficiency or cooling efficiency, particularly when we start to take into account matters like global warming potential of refrigerants and so on and so forth. So the way that procurement works around this model is crucial to ensuring that we can deliver on the objectives, not just of cost saving, but also the environmental benefits of low global warming refrigerants and reducing energy consumption over the life of the project. Vida, I think we've got your pop-up again with the to-do list. If you can just close that and move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And as an investor or an investment manager, this is really all about risks and understanding the risks, seeing who the appropriate party is to manage them, and then mitigating them. And this just sets out what those essential risks are and how we approach that. And essentially, the solution is that the SPV with the fund above it is responsible for taking on and managing all of these crucial risks. So first of all, the host credit risk. First of all, as an investment manager, it's our job to understand what that basic credit quality is and make a decision in the first place about whether the host meets the right credit performance levels that we need. But we can also look at ways of mitigating that through things like parent company guarantees or potentially risk participation guarantees where those are available. That's a more complicated approach. But we also look at how we can make smaller projects efficient by being able to replicate the commercial structure under one parent company, again with a parent company guarantee, where it probably wouldn't be so attractive or sensible to do that on a standalone basis with a single smaller project. So there's a lot of consolidation and corporate structuring going on behind that host credit risk area that we're very experienced in managing. And then the next big area is the performance of the project, because the essential characteristic of a cooling as a service agreement or an energy service agreement is that the SPV takes that delivery risk. So if the cooling or the energy efficiency service is not delivered, then the SPV doesn't get paid or gets a reduced payment. So how that is managed is through the contract structure with the underlying ESCO and the O&M delivery partners that are providing the underlying technology. And what we would look to do is have a sort of back-to-back flow through of those risks through to the EPC and the O&M partner. So to the extent that the SPV is not being paid because of an under-delivery of the defined performance parameter, then we would be able to claim that back from the ESCO that's responsible for delivering that performance, or through the warranties with the OEM technology provider. That's a straightforward concept. It's very important to look at how that works in practice, because often exposure and liability of EPC and O&M contractors are capped under standard sort of commercial principles, and it's a really important requirement of what we do to make sure that matching performance risk is nailed down in the contracts. And that's something that we've got a lot of experience with. And then the next category is technology risk. And really the trick here is to not do anything risky, bluntly. And we always rely on using commercially proven technologies with a strong track record and with equipment warranties that we can back up with insurance policies. So really the technology risk is one that can be covered off by simply not taking unnecessary levels of technology risk, and that works very effectively because these technologies are well proven and they work, and and they're reliable. And then finally, operating and maintenance risk is absolutely crucial in particularly the cooling space, because as many of you will know, one of the crucial issues that's causing so many problems is that these types of assets are often left in place for many years, not run properly and operate suboptimally, so that they're far less efficient than they're supposed to be, and need a lot more maintenance than they're supposed to need. And that's often because in-house teams just don't pay enough attention to this and treat it as something that needs to be fixed when it goes wrong, but don't do enough preventative maintenance. So if as the entity that's liable for the lifelong operation of the asset according to contracted performance KPIs, it's clearly necessary for us to cover that through a very well-structured operating and maintenance agreement with the appropriate counterparty that's obliged to deliver that performance year on year according to the KPIs that are set in the contract, and that's achieved through effective preventative maintenance and appropriate monitoring, these days mostly remotely, which can predict or anticipate problems in effect before they happen. And that's really one of the crucial parts of the cooling as a service concept, in that operational maintenance risk is carried by the SPV and the related O&M counterparty for the life of the project, and that each year of, or each day of the contract is something that is maintained, and a great deal of attention is paid to that on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. And then finally, just to wrap up on this section, a summary of the value proposition for the host. And I think many of you will have seen the diagram on the left, or diagrams like that, where the idea is that the annual service charge that the host pays is to some level fixed, and is less than what they would otherwise be paying if they did nothing. That's essentially the principle that's applied here, although it's important to emphasize that the level of savings that are typically achieved in a cooling project may not be so high that they fully fund the investment. The crucial thing is, what would the host alternative be if it had to replace all of the chillers on its own and incur the cost for that? So that differential between what they have to pay the ESCO through the service agreement and what they'd otherwise have to pay is not just against doing nothing, because that often isn't going to be an option. It's against what the alternative approach would be if they did that without the ESCO. And there's one important feature which I apologize, I forgot to mention, which is that the service charge can be structured so that it would be classified as an off-balance sheet investment by the host auditors, and so it's treated purely as an O&M payment, and it doesn't incur any liabilities on the host balance sheet. So in many cases, the alternative is having to self-fund the investment, which might be a slightly lower cost of capital, but it results in balance sheet liabilities for that funding, but also, and this is what's illustrated in the middle section, in that situation, the host would carry all of the construction, commissioning, and operational risks associated with the project, whereas under the ESCO model that we do at SDCL, all of those risks are carried by SDCL, and the client, in effect, has none. I mean, it only pays for the service that it receives. And then, just to summarize on the right, the other key point is that it is a single point of responsibility. So the host only sees one contracting partner, that's SDCL, that takes responsibility for all of the project development and implementation and operation through the investment grade audit right through to construction, and then going into the operating phase where the service fees start being paid, and we take responsibility for all of the O&M contracts, underneath all of that, the EPC contracts, and managing all the various warranties that that come in from the different technology suppliers. So that's a brief summary of what SDCL does, the commercial approach, and the value proposition for host clients. And Jim's now going to explain a little bit about the partnership that we have with the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, and how that's been developed by us to help fund cooling projects in Asia and Africa. So over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everybody. If we could just quickly go to the next slide, Vita. What I'd like to frame for everybody is going to be slightly different than what Thomas has outlined in terms of the cooling as a service model, and Peter's specific comments to sort of the finance and financial issues which underpin the cooling as a service, and quickly give everybody an overview of what we're doing within this context of the cooling as a service model specific to the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because we want to save enough time for question and answer. The Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program has its antecedent really in the Montreal Protocol. Many of you will know it, considered one of the most successful international agreements ever. The Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol is looking at the phase down of HFC or hydrofluorocarbons, that was the production and the consumption. And when we look at HFCs, we're looking at this issue, and Peter alluded to it, of refrigerants and gases that are largely found in refrigeration, air conditioning, and then heat pump equipment, which are thousands of times more harmful to the climate than CO2, and could account for up to 20% of climate pollution by 2050. So when we look to, and it's important to think about it, when we look to this issue of global warming potential within what our activities are right now under the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, it is in fact a cornerstone of what we're trying to achieve within our grant. And again, I'll come back to that. So the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, essentially, it's a philanthropic initiative. It represents donor capital being used as catalytic capital to unleash private and public sector money. Our grant specifically is looking at Asia and Africa. For the purposes of today, I'll speak really to our experience and our findings so far in Asia. And I do want to just reference, we're looking, as that last bullet point highlights, we're looking at the industrial and commercial operations of global companies or regional companies with operations in emerging markets. And that gets to one of Peter's first points there on that counterparty credit risk. And that is important. And that's something which right now we are facing in a couple of key countries in terms of our activities to date under Kigali to implement cooling as a service. Next slide, please, Vita. And I think this slide, which some of you may or may not have seen, is a fundamentally important slide to what we're trying to do within the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. And the data is originally from IEA, worked out by IEA. Some of you may be aware of a report that came out in December 2019, published by the Economist Intelligence Unit and KSEP, referred to as the cooling imperative. And you'll see from this slide simply the seriousness of the cooling problem. Base made reference to 30% of electricity in cooling, and Thomas referred to it rather in his early slide. When you look at the countries that are identified here, for SDCL, our activity under the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, Indonesia, China, and India are three of our key countries that we're looking at, and particularly Indonesia. And when you look at this phenomena of cooling degree days and the impact in 70-odd years, 50, 70 years of a warming climate, and we overlay this phenomena of urbanization, and what we're really faced with is a perfect storm in terms of the use of refrigerants and refrigeration and air conditioning to combat a world which is getting hotter and needs more cooling. So on the next slide, Vita, if you wouldn't mind, these comments in this warming, the cooling imperative, a warming climate or a warming globe, it really brings us to what we're seeing right now from specific to Asia as an opportunity, the Asia Cooling and Energy Efficiency Fund. And sort of what we see as sort of some unique proposition to market opportunities is that we want to bring a new investment vehicle which is going to be focused on cooling and energy efficiency, as well as distributed generation, to be fair, within Asia. We, SDCL, as Peter mentioned, we are a leading energy efficiency investment manager with public-private partners or government-backed institutional funds managed around the world. So we have the experience, and we believe that we can bring that experience to develop projects in the commercial sector, in the industrial sector, in terms of hospitality and healthcare, data centers, etc., where we can act on the ground in Asia, really at the intersection of the energy markets and the built environment. And within this backdrop of a warming climate and a warming globe, and the need to address more efficient cooling, a key piece of the puzzle in addressing this problem is going to be the mobilization of capital. Our initial portfolio right now, the activities that we've, the investment grade audits that Peter referred to that we've funded have been in the hospitality sector, the manufacturing sector, and the real estate sector. Okay, and we have, as of today, we have approximately 23 projects that are at the IGA stage, so they are in process of feasibility studies, or we have completed, and we are now moving towards financing stage. And that is across 5 countries right now, and various counterparties, everything from multinational corporations to individual asset owners in an emerging market. So for us, the 23 projects represent really just the tip of the spear of what we believe this opportunity to be. And in fact, our opportunity pipeline today, we are looking at about 850 individual projects across 90 counterparties or 90 hosts. And we think that that opportunity pipeline, and that only reflects right now, as I said, about 5 countries, but we think that that opportunity pipeline, with the sort of execution on a few of our distribution strategies, we think that that can grow significantly in the very near term. Again, as Peter's mentioned, and I won't overemphasize it, but we believe with the experience that we've garnered globally that we can bring into Asia the ability to deploy capital at a fund level into specific projects, into countries very, very competitively. And the pipeline that we're putting together, I've listed there just a few of the key countries that we're focused on right now: Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, but also development activity in the Philippines, China, as well as the greater Mekong sub-region. And if I can ask you please to go to the next slide. So the grant, and Peter referred to it, is looking at this issue of investment grade audits and deploying capital, the donor capital, to take that discussion off. And in other words, a phrase that you'll often hear is that we don't have to engage in a host with regard to a capital allocation or a capex. We're taking that discussion off of the table. And what we're doing is we're delivering that through this, as Peter's outlined, and I won't repeat, through that fully financed package where there's a single point of access, single point of responsibility, and the assumption of the various risks which are intrinsic to an energy efficiency or a cooling and energy efficiency retrofit project are addressed. And I think that it's important that we sort of just step back too for a second. When we look at what we're doing in these countries, it is really very, very important that we work closely with ESCOs who are professional, experienced, have regional but and possibly global platforms that are capable of supporting what we're trying to achieve in a given country in terms of cooling and energy efficiency opportunities. But I'd also then like to say what's important about what we're doing in terms of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program and what I've termed the HALO is that we're partnering with other KCEP grantees as well as global NGOs to develop these new cooling and energy efficiency opportunities, whether it's obviously in this case now with BASE, but entities such as the International Tourism Partnership or the Climate Group or LBNL out of the United States or ClimateWorks. These are global platforms and or think tanks or entities which operate in this cooling and energy efficiency space, and it behooves us as SDCL, as a private investor, to partner with them. And then I'd just add here the 4 sectors that we're really focused on: property, real estate, manufacturing, healthcare, and then sort of retail, hospitality, data centers, etc. And then I'd like to move quickly just to the last slide. What we've tried to do here, and in the interest of time, is just summarize sort of some preliminary conclusions and what we can sort of take away right now as we're 13, 14 months into this journey. One, cooling and energy efficiency, and Thomas alluded to this, if not outright commented on it. It's probably the most cost-effective way of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, right, and improving energy infrastructure. And I think what's important is that we're trying to improve the performance of these assets from a financial, environmental, and from an infrastructure perspective, so the resilience of these assets. I think what's also important to make is that the statement, there is a gap but there's also an opportunity in terms of funding. So I do believe that, and we as SDCL believe it's possible to allocate capital, equity and debt to address the cooling and energy efficiency challenge. Another issue, though, that I think it's important to highlight, the EIU came out, the Economist Intelligence Unit came out, and their report talked about a $135 billion opportunity. Thomas had larger numbers. In Asia, but elsewhere, we still see an issue where solar is more sexy. It's more commonly understood. It has more resonance, whether that's with regard to Apple or simply putting rooftop on your solar, rooftop solar on an asset. It's tangible and it's seen. When we talk about energy efficiency, cooling and energy efficiency, we're talking about the guts of the basic plant and equipment at a building. And that's something which within Asia we are trying to change. We are trying to make it better understood to asset owners that this is in fact a very fundamental way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving their financial performance. A couple of other points that we'd emphasize: the development cycle right now in Asia with regard to closing of deals, it's just taking too long. And I think that part of that is related to the following. One is just simply disconnects between the various silos within a business, whether that's the engineering side versus finance versus sustainability. The other is the cost of capital, right? A risk and reward issue. And then what's important is that, frankly, in energy, cooling and energy efficiency, the investment numbers are typically relatively low. This is not a large power station. So then we come to our final points that I'd like to make. When we talk about this issue of refrigeration and gases, absolutely fundamental, and what we're trying to do under the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program is improve that. What we are seeing is the need for the manufacturers, the global OEMs who are producing these large chillers and cooling equipment. We need to see them attentive to the objectives and aspirations of ourselves as investors and as of the host to have more efficient technology. Our distribution strategies have been around the supply chain, banks, insurance companies, and hospitality, and we're seeing a significant amount of uptick with probably the least amount of attention to date coming from the insurance sector. Another conclusion we're seeing is the nexus between cooling and energy efficiency and indoor air quality. And in certain countries, such as Hong Kong and Philippines, we believe that that'll be a fundamental part of our value proposition. And then in conclusion, the Kigali Halo has been an absolute game changer for us in the region in terms of raising awareness about this cooling imperative. And then last but not least, we see that the cooling and energy efficiency amidst this pandemic situation, it is hopefully counter-cyclical, and hopefully we can bring capital to address sort of the basic issues in and around the performance of assets. We as an asset, as an investor, as an equity investor, we believe that we can move and partner with companies, asset owners in the region to achieve a much more efficient asset at the end of the day. And Vida, I'll stop there in the interest of time and open it up hopefully for some question and answer.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and then Peter and Jim for these comprehensive presentations and in-depth insights into the mechanics of cooling in the service and the opportunities. We're running a bit short on time, so we'll have time for a couple of questions, but Thomas has kindly offered to also respond to the questions in writing, so we'll be sending you a compilation later on. One of the questions that we've gotten is about the presentation and the recording. Yes, these will be available online, and I will be sending you an email with a link that you can access. So time for a couple of questions, as I said. Thomas and colleagues, could you comment on why electricity price is included and how price fluctuations are managed?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll take that, or I'll start with it. Electricity price is included in the cooling as a service to the client because this way the client is not exposed to the performance risk anymore. if the technology provider is the one who is bearing the costs of the operation fully, including electricity, then there's a strong incentive for the technology provider to actually install the most efficient system, because he'll be the one paying for these costs, and also to offer maintenance, preventative maintenance, in such a way that the efficiency is always kept as the highest possible to minimize the cost to deliver the service to the client. With regard to the fluctuation, the price charged per ton of refrigeration should be indexed to electricity price. So the fluctuation is not a risk that the technology provider or the SPV should be taking. So the price is basically indexed to electricity prices.
Maybe if I could just add a clarification onto that. I think Thomas has described it well. That's only, you can vary that approach a little bit, and actually normally we would seek to not carry the electricity supply and price risk. Commercially, in one sense, it doesn't make any difference, because as long as it's appropriately indexed in the service charge, then any variations in electricity price will flow through. But you don't have to have the ESCO be the electricity buyer. The host can continue to take the electricity supply and pay for it, so long as the performance KPIs are set in the service agreement to ensure that the cooling assets or the energy generation assets, as the case may be, operate to the agreed energy efficiency performance levels. That then, you know, the net result is the same, as the service agreement provides for the efficiency to be achieved, and with penalty payments if it isn't. So you don't have to be paying for the electricity. You can, but it works both ways.
Thank you. And a follow-up question around the sectors in which cooling as a service could be possible. A commercial sector was mentioned, but what about supermarkets, the retail sector, and the agricultural sector with cold chain? Would there be potentials also in these sectors?
Maybe I'll quickly comment on that. So we launched an incubator early this year to support different companies in different sectors to implement cooling as a service. And a couple of the companies we work with are working with industrial refrigeration, like supermarkets, or with cold chain, for instance, for agriculture, like cold rooms, off-grid cold rooms to store food to enable farmers to access high value markets, and also education, such as universities. So there are many different sectors that could be applicable, and maybe Jim and Peter also want to comment on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. From an Asia perspective, as per the comments about a warming planet, cold chain is a fundamental part of the process, and it's certainly our primary strategy with regard to Africa. I'd add it's important and fundamentally important, in fact, not only for the agricultural sector, so trying to get into that first mile, but it's also important in terms of pharmaceutical and medicine distribution. So we are working right now in discussions with Asia's largest pharmaceutical distributor, active across Indonesia and Vietnam and Philippines and other countries in the region, who need to have certain, within the different categories of temperature requirements, but need to have at certain points for special medicine, certainly the resilient and appropriate cooling capability. So that cold storage, as Thomas has just referred to, is absolutely very important.
Great, thanks so much. So a wide applicability and an increasing scope and increasing experiences along a range of different sectors. Another question, can cooling as a service be combined with energy efficiency improvements? So other energy efficiency improvements, energy efficiency in buildings, some renovation works. Are there opportunities to combine cooling as a service with other types of activities?
I'll come in on that one with a very, very simple answer. Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the great advantages in that approach works really well within the cooling as a service and energy efficiency as a service concept. You know, the contractors are there, all of the credit work's done, all of the contract work's been done, and it makes absolute sense to look at all of these opportunities at the same time. So, so not just yes, it can be, but that's one of the approaches that you know, really works well.
Right, thank you. And in terms of risks, we got a really good overview of how risks are managed. But when it comes to assessment of technology risk, how can new technologies break into this space? And what's required for the strong track record that was mentioned?
You know, can I step into this one, Rita? You know, one of the key issues we're seeing for that, to answer that question bluntly, is to see what kind of insurance programs the particular technology provider has. And in fact, it's really becoming a bit the role of insurance in terms as a backstop to these performance guarantees that a new startup technology provider might provide is really a one way to pre-qualify that technology provider. And I think that's going to be increasingly a part and parcel as new and emerging technologies come to the fore, whether that's chiller optimization, analytics, etc. There's going to be an important role for the insurance industry to play in the development of that new sort of what I'll term clean tech technology.
And maybe if I make a compliment, I totally agree with Jim, and I'd also like to add here that cooling as a service really, since the customer is purchasing the cooling service, it doesn't really matter how the provider is delivering that service, which means there's a lot of space for innovation for the provider. For instance, it might be that there's a big difference between electricity prices during the day, during the night, that it makes sense to install cold storage, that there's a lot of different things that could be added that would enable the provider to reduce its cost to deliver the service. And the provider has the freedom to basically use innovation. And very often technology providers are the ones that best understand the impact of innovation rather than their customers or than the cooling users. So it gives space to explore this.
Excellent, thanks so much. So final question. So we heard about cooling as a service. What are the possibilities of looking at other services, such as lighting for a service, heating as a service, in industrial context, compressed air as a service? Would it be fundamentally different from the approach that we heard about today, or are there almost unlimited possibilities to start offering everything as a service?
I'll just dive in on that one, I think, and say yes. I mean, I think it's a little bit similar to the other question in that all of those different technologies can be wrapped up into the service approach. Just, I mean, to emphasize one thing about it, what commercially we as SDCL or our SPV would offer is availability. So that's the essential service that's being provided, is all that technology has been made available to provide heating, cooling, whatever the lighting, and all of those utilities, if you like, can be wrapped up into a service-based approach. So yes, from a technology perspective, yes, from a commercial service-based approach, yes, all of those things can be done at the same time, and it's very efficient to do it that way. So that's what we always like to try and do.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And we've run over time a little bit. So I'd like to finalize the webinar on this positive note that yes, a lot of things can be offered as services. And as we heard today, increasing number of projects are underway, new approaches are underway, and the results are very promising. We got a lot of questions, and as I mentioned, we will try to address some of these in written at a later stage. The webinar will be recorded and will be available online, and the presentation will be available. And I think the interest from our participants today showed that this is a topic that we will need to revisit as progress continues in the area of cooling as a service, and as some of the interesting projects and initiatives that we heard about today start to bear fruit and have some lessons learned that we can all draw from. With that, I'd like to end this webinar and wish you a good continuation, and please do stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.